So why don't we begin by having you tell us about your personal and family background?
Well, I grew up in the Depression era in the 1930s or 1940s, and black people were invisible. When they went to the movies, black people sat in the balcony, and we never saw them. They had their own clubs, they had their own places, they had their own parties, but they lived a very segregated life. And I lived in Westchester County, which is outside of New York, about 30 miles away from New York City. And so black people were just not part of our conversation. They were not part of our everyday life. We didn't see them all the time. The only time we ever saw them was doing physical labor, and we just never thought about it. In my home, it was never discussed, and if it was, there was never any disparaging words. My parents, I would say, were respectful, but they had very little to do with black people. The first black person that I really knew was, her name was Mary. And Mary was about 5 or 6 years older than me, so I guess she was maybe 13 or 14. And Mary went to junior high school, and she was allowed to get off at 2 o'clock, and because to get a job, and she worked in my house as I use the word because I can't think of anything right now. She used the word as a maid. She was the maid, and Mary came in and she cleaned up the house and helped make the beds. But basically, Mary came home about an hour before I got out of school, and she took care of my sister. And Mary grew up with us. Mary stayed with us for about, I guess, about 15 years. But one of the most interesting things to me was the fact that she married a man named Sidney Jones. Sidney was very dark skinned. And when I would see Sidney on the street, and I was by that time maybe 16, 15, 16, I would shake his hand. And years later, Mary told me that how important it was to Sidney that a white man would shake his hand in public. And to me, I never thought about it. There was Sidney, and he was married to Mary, and I shook his hand. It's a story that I've always remembered, and that was 70, 70 some odd years ago. But as I say, I grew up in this town of White Plains, and it was segregated, but there was not a large black population. And essentially, they were invisible. We never thought about it. All the movies had white people, and everybody on radio was white except for the cartoon black folks. So it was never a part of our life. I became aware of all of a sudden the indecency of it, and that's a word I really would use, indecent. It took away the dignity. I became aware of it when I was about 16 or 17 years old. And at that point, I, uh, I started to get involved in it because somehow or other, why were they invisible? And then I remembered that there were two young girls who I had gone to school with from the time of the first grade, and they were there in high school, and I never had spoken to them. And I remember their names to this day, and there are very few kids that I went to grade school with that I remember. But by name, they were Lula Ann High and Irma Bowser. And I remembered their names. And one day I went over to them and I introduced myself and I said, I've never met you really, and you and I were in classes. And by the way, she was in the rapid class. Our classes, when we were in junior high school and then in high school, were R, M, and I forgot what the third one was. But R was rapid, M was medium, and third was not. And they were in the rapid classes all the way through. Anyway, I got to shake hands, talk to them, and they became people that I knew. The first real black people that I ever knew by name. Uh, I went to college at Syracuse, and here again, the schools were white, the teachers were white, the fraternities and sororities were white, and in my senior year, we had a young black fellow rush the fraternity. And I was the one who was most vocal about getting him into the fraternity. And I remember our executive director at that time, national director, came up and said, "Boys, you can't do this. Our biggest, most important chapters are in Florida, in Georgia, in South Carolina, and you cannot." Well, I said, "Yes, we can, and we are." Uh, we took him in. And in the Army, there was a young fella, my name was Ivers, and his name was Irvis. And we were together, we stood next together and we were in line, and Irvis and I. But I had friends in the Army, and it was first becoming integrated. This was in the 50s, early 50s. And, but to me, there was no such thing as a black person and a white person. I had grown up and nobody ever told me there was a difference. And because of it, it was a sort of a self-discovery. Why aren't there more black people in my life? And Mary had got me into jazz. And when I was in high school, I got to go back a minute. Uh, I became aware, I guess when I was about 16 years old, that there was, it was hard to describe. I didn't know what the word, I'd never heard the word segregation. And I just knew the South was a bad place and that I lived up north. And uh, I remember in high school, in junior high school, the president of our class, his name was Bill Thomas, and he was a bright, handsome young man, and he was a black man, and he had a great future. Bill had sickle cell anemia and died when he was like 16 or 17 years old. But he was, and of course, the two gals, Irma and Lula High. I was never very friendly with them, but at least I got to know them and talk to them. And then in high school, the head cheerleader was a black man and a black youngster. His name was Russell. His last name was Russell. I can't think of his first name. And then on our football team, there was a great big fullback, and his name was George Rooks, Rooks. I'll never forget him, who after he graduated high school became a policeman. But those are the black people that I knew. And then when I went to college, as I said before, I brought this young black guy into the fraternity, and oh boy, were the national really upset about it. Now, this is 1952, 53, but I was more politically involved. I, uh, I strongly backed the Democratic candidate. His name was Stevenson, Adlai Stevenson. I loved him because he had a wonderful way of speaking. In those days, they would have half hours. They would buy a half hour on television and they would speak for a half hour. Anyway, uh, in the Army, when I was drafted after I graduated, I was in the Army with black guys and slept with them, and I never it never bothered me. I never thought anything special about it. Well, I get out of the service and I decide, what do I want to do? Well, I was an art major, among other things, with three minors, and I decided to go into advertising, do something in advertising. In those days, and I'm talking about the 50s, advertising was a big thing. Television was opening up a market, and radio was still big, and advertising, newspapers, it was just, it, it was something I was going to go into. And I was interviewing for a job with a company named A. Stein and Company, and I was talking to Mr. Stein, or one of the Steins, and a guy leans over and whispers in my ear, "You're wasting your time." He says, "You're a salesman, and that's where you belong." He says, "Come into my office." And he, again, still hadn't seen my face, didn't know my name. He said, "Come into my office on Monday, you're hired, and I'll put you on the sales force." I went home to my father. We sat around, and he said, "Well, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, there's two things I want to do. I think I want to get the hell out of here because there's too much snow and it's too cold and I don't like it anymore." I'd been in Korea where there was snow. I went to Syracuse University where there was snow. And when I got back to White Plains, there was 6 inches of snow on the ground. So I decided I wanted to go down south. I didn't owe anyone down south. I had no friends. I had no one that I knew. But anyway, I said to my father, "Well, I think I want to go down south." But then again, a guy whispered in my ear, and I told him the story. And I said, "What do you think I should do?" And he said to me, "You're 22 years old, 23 years old. What do you got to lose? If a guy's going to hire you, doesn't even know your name, give it a shot." So I went in to meet the guy, and he said, "Well, are you the guy that I said, "Yes, I'm the one you spoke to." So he said, "Well, shook hands, and next thing I know, I'm a salesman." And the job they gave me initially, because I was going to learn the business, I found out, first of all, that they sold men's belts. It was a famous brand at that time called Paris Belts. But their big division was women's underwear, bras and girdles. And he was in the division that ran the bra and girdle department. So I came home to my mother and I said, "Mom, guess what? I'm going to be a bra and girdle salesman." Well, she laughed and laughed and laughed. Next thing I know, he calls me into the office about 2 or 3 weeks later. He says, "Guess what?" I said, "What?" He says, "The guy who has been selling bras and girdles is in Florida, has to have an emergency appendectomy, and we'd like you to take his place because the line has just come out." I said, "I don't know anything about it." I had a 48-hour course in underwear and bras and girdles, and down I went. The first thing I noticed when I came down south was segregation. I had never seen it before. Pulled into a gas station. I said, "Where's the restroom?" And they pointed, and I saw the signs, white, colored. I'd never seen it before. I'd heard about it, I'd read about it, but I never saw it.
And what year was this?
1955. Something else, when I went into the stores, I noticed something else that,
Well, let's go back to the gas station. So
Okay.
you see the signs.
yeah,
And what kind of impression did that make on you?
Well, I was absolutely struck. It just destroyed me. I had never seen it before. Up north, there were no segregated, there were no segregated restrooms or segregated drinking fountains or anything like that. I'd never seen it. I didn't know what it was. And it just hit me that there was such a thing that existed. I didn't know. Well, I sold bras and girdles, and I was very successful. And they offered me a job. At that time, I think I was 26 or 27. They offered me a job to, they wanted to transfer me, and they were going to make me the regional sales manager. I said, where is it going to be? He says, North and South Dakota, Idaho, Montana. I said, no. I said, sorry, I'm not going. Then my mom got sick, and I decided to leave the company and went back to my dad to be with him. And my mom died. And but by that time, I had liked the South. Things were changing, and I liked the change. But I really wasn't that involved in it. Uh, when I went to stores, uh, it was business, and the other thing that struck me when I traveled in the small towns in the South, black people didn't try clothes on; they bought them. The other thing I noticed was that black people were never called by Mr. or Mrs. They were only called with their first names. That was something I noticed right away. So I saw indecency. It's the word I kept about. It's indecent. It wasn't the decent thing to do in behavior. In behavior, it bothered me, and I became very involved in it in the sense that I felt it was so there was just no justice. But I was a salesman there, and I'd gone home to my mom. I was back up north, but I liked the weather. I liked it down south. And by that time, they had given me a territory, they'd carved it out, and I lived in Atlanta. And Atlanta was a sea of change. And I remember going down to the major department store. It was called Rich's. The black kids were demonstrating, and they were dressed beautifully. They were wearing suits, and they were sport coats, and they were beautifully, very traditional Ivy League type stuff. And I said, well, I wonder where that store is. So I went out there because future customers sell my belts, and there was nothing there. And so I said, maybe, just maybe, I open up a store there, a campus shop like the ones I call on in Athens and in South Carolina and so on and so forth. And then I discovered there was Morehouse and Morris Brown at Clark College and Atlanta University, and also there was a school of theology down there. And I looked around, there was nothing there. I said, you know what? I think I'm going to go into business and I'm going to put a shop there that will cater to these kids because they really were dressed nicely. And so in 19, oh, by that time it was 1960. Yeah. I'd just gotten married, and in 1961, I signed a lease on a street at that time was called Hunter Street. And may I add that Subsequently, it was changed to Martin Luther King Boulevard, but that's getting ahead of myself. I still didn't know a soul. The day I signed my lease was the day my son was born. Did you know that?
October 23rd.
That's the day I signed my lease in 1961. And I opened the store, and it was a college store. I had red doors, old fashioned, and interior. It was just like a college shop. That was the only way I knew how to do it. And I had button-down shirts, three-button suits, and ripped ties. In the back, I had a department for shoes. And I also sold two kinds of shoes: wingtip dress and loafers. All I sold. But I had a table and chairs, and it became a sort of a meeting place where people would come in and sit down and talk. But initially, when that store opened, everybody looked and said, "What is this?" And they walked in really out of curiosity.
And what was the name of your
And
store?
it was called Campus and Career. And of course, it was based upon the fact that young people, well, it was essentially a young people's store. Uh, they wore traditional, what we call traditional or Ivy League clothes, and that's what I carried. Uh, Button-down shirts, uh, ripped ties, and they looked, because that's not what they were used to seeing in that neighborhood. And for me, it was the only kind of store that I would operate. It was a college store, college clothes. And when they first came in, it was curiosity. And then I soon learned that after a while, when they came in, they got to know me, and I just never thought of color. It never dawned on me. And then later on, the student movement began, and guys like Julian would come in, and well, he came. He was always a big guy. I never had his size. And some of the other people who came in, and doctors, and then I had my real estate agent was Q.E. Williamson, who later became the first black city councilman. And these were people that I knew, people that I talked to. And we talked about a million things. But there were other things that they wanted to be heard with opinions about, not racism. And so they had no desire. Their interest was way beyond that in terms of intellectual interest. And it was a pleasure. I mean, we would talk about history, and we would talk about astronomy, and all the things that they knew about, that they were educated for. And so I just hard to describe it.
Why don't you talk about some of the people you met who, when they were either students or just starting out, ended up becoming notable, and what you might have seen in them?
Uh, well, of course, they were just kids. They were 20 and 21 years old. And the things that the students became notable for are the things that came long after. Uh, there was a law firm, and I was friendly with the men who were in that firm. One of them was Don Hollowell, who just was a marvelous human being, and Horace Ward. And then the NACP office was there, and a young man, tall, well, he was a tall, dark, good-looking, featured man. His name was Vernon Jordan. And Vernon was just, he and I just got together. We were friends. We spoke. We talked about baseball and football, just about everything except NAACP affairs. I guess they didn't want to burden me with that. I don't know what the reason was. Um, Gee, when I think about it, there are a number of young men who went to work for me, and gee, I don't know why, but their names have gone by. But I had two doctors, about three or four preachers, and their interest, they were trying to impress me with their intellect. And then came the young men who were involved in SNCC. And Julian brought them in. I had known Julian before. Julian was on a national tour. He would speak, and he was very popular in colleges. And then he came to me and he said, "I got to ask your advice." I said, "Okay." And what was the advice he wanted? Some firm of booking or people that book speakers had contacted him, and they wanted to handle him, and they offered him $15,000 and expenses for every speech that he made. Well, he'd been doing these other ones free, and he came to me. He said, and I reminded, this was what 60 some odd years ago. Well, he came to me and he said, "Do I take it? Should I take them? What should I do?" I said, "Take the money, take the money." And so Julian went on a national speaking tour. He became quite famous. Then he ran for office on the state legislature and was elected. But the state legislature, in their wisdom, decided they would seat him because he was an opponent to the Vietnam War. And I took part in a demonstration outside the state capitol in favor of Julian and having him seated. And there were some others who were marching who were against the Vietnamese War. Anyway, there was the FBI taking my picture along with the city police and not by me personally, but everybody who marched. And so the FBI then came to my office, into my store one day to interview me. And they wanted to know a little bit about my background and my family and my political thinking. And I talked to them and I said, "Well, I said, it just doesn't seem fair. Man's elected to represent the people, and the people represent him, and they chose him. And eventually, I think he was seated, and he became more and more of a celebrity. And busy, oh, he was busy all the time. And on top of that, he was married, he had a couple of kids. Anyway, Julian was in and out of my life for, I guess, about 7 or 8 years. And then became, famous, just as Vernon Jordan did, and Don Hollowell. Across the street, the Pascal brothers opened up what I thought was phenomenal. They had once had a little dumpy little restaurant that sold fried chicken. They opened up this place that had a beautiful dining room, and in addition to that, they had a motel. And underneath the motel, you had to drive into it down. On the other side, they had a nightclub called La Carousel. Well, I used to eat at that place, 4 or 5 times a week. And
And what was it most famous for?
fried chicken and fried chicken sandwich, they called it. But actually, what it was a chicken breast and on toast, just 2 pieces of toast. It was great chicken. I once asked Mr. Pascal, there were three brothers, Bill and, gee, I can't think of the others. But I'd asked Mr. Pascal about what was the secret to his chicken. And he told me that he soaked it overnight in buttermilk. Well, I tried that at home. It never tasted like Mr. Pascal's chicken anyway. That was the place we went. And then I had a doctor, a dentist, excuse me. His name was Jerry Reed. I'll never forget it. And Jerry was a young man, I guess those days, in his late 30s, early 40s. He was very involved in integration and was very involved in the segregation that existed at Emory University in the School of Dentistry. Jerry had financially backed some fast food restaurants. I remember one for sure was a Burger King. Anyway, one day, Jerry, he used to come by every Saturday to have lunch, came by with Dr. King. Uh, Funny thing, Dr. King always called me Mike, and I never called him anything but Dr. King. Anyway, he came in with Dr. King, and he came in with a young German, a young German fellow, a kid. He must have been 18 or 19 years old. Well, I was a Jew, and when I heard him talk, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. And we had some small conversations and spoke for a few minutes. And then Jerry said, well, we're all going across the street to Pascal's to have a sandwich. Come on and join us. Well, I wasn't going to sit down uh, with this young German because I had grown up hating Germans and anything that had to do with Germany. And so I said, no, I've got to stay back here. There's some things I have to do. And with that, they turned around, but Dr. King stood fast. And he says, I want to talk to Mike about something. And the other two left. And then that's when he put his hand on my shoulder. And it said to me, Mike, I saw your face. And I saw what anger and hatred can do to you. And he said to me, that fellow, Kirk, whatever his name was, he says, he wasn't even aware of what effect that you had on him. And he said, that's the difference. He doesn't have any anger or anything else. And here you are, just full of hatred, and I can see it. He says, you can't go through life like this. He says, that boy was born long after the war. He said, he is innocent. And you cannot carry hatred in your heart. It's self-destructive. And with that, he clasped a couple of times on my shoulder, and he said, come on and join us. And I walked out with him, and we went across the street and had lunch. But the way he said it, and the way he talked to me, he altered my life forever. And I have, to this day, kept hatred out of my heart. And in terms of politics, sometimes that's a little bit difficult. But I have been a much happier man from that day on. And I've tried to keep hatred out of my heart. And when I traveled to Europe, I enjoyed uh, uh, visiting Germany. And I'll never forget the time we were in Munich, and my wife and I were sitting in a coffee shop uh, in the square in Munich. Right across the street was the famous Munich church and the clock, the figures that came out every hour, and then the city hall was next to it. Anyway, people were walking by and I saw black people. And at that time, even then, the Germans had a large Arab population, mostly from Turkey. And I saw that people were doing fine and that it was what King had told me 20 years before was a lesson well learned. And I felt very good about that I could sit there in Munich, Germany, and there was no hatred, no anger, or anything else in my heart. And I thought 20 years before this, I would have just never even walked. I never put a step inside Germany. It was a big change. It was something that affected me.
Do you remember the night that he was assassinated?
Yes. The store was still open. And my neighbor next door, Mr. Williamson, QV Williamson, QV, nice guy. Anyway, he came in, he said they shot Dr. King. And he said, if I were you, he said, I'd close the store. Well, not only did I close the store, but I went to the flower shop, got 2 wreaths. I had 2 doors, so I closed the store and I put those 2 wreaths up. And I stayed closed the following day. And when I came back to open the store, which was 2 days later, or a day later, I don't know what it was. Nothing, nothing. But all around me, the few white businesses that were there had broken windows, and they tried to stay open and they had to close. But I was closed, and nothing happened. So in a sense, I felt, relieved. And QV said that people knew who you were. People knew who you were, and that's why my store was unaffected. But King's death was a major blow. He was a central figure. Uh, there was nobody like him, and there has been no one since, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, one day Julian came in with a fellow that looked like he might have weighed about 125 pounds. And Julian said to me, "This is John Lewis." I shook his hand. And he said, "John is going to be in the March on Washington and is going to represent us and be the speaker."
And did you know who John was at this time? Like what he had already
Didn't have
done?
it. How could I know him? I didn't know anything about John Lewis. He said, "John needs a suit. He doesn't have a suit." I said, "Okay, I'll be glad to help him." And then Julian said, "He doesn't have any money." I said, "Wait a minute." He said, "No." He said, "John's going to take care of it." So I said, "How are you going to take care of it?" He said, "Well, I have $5." He says, "and every week, or every week and a half," he says, "I'll come in and give you $2 until the suit's paid for." I said, "Well, if you're willing to do that, I'm willing to sell you the suit for what it cost me." So we sold John a black suit, 3-button white shirt, white black tie. We dressed him up like $1,000,000. He gave me his crumpled $5 bill, and every week he came in until he paid off. He paid off that suit. Years later, I couldn't believe it. John had been elected to Congress, and I congratulated him when he came by Pascal's once, and he said, "I still remember you." And then in later years, he weighed at least twice as much as he weighed when I first met him. He was a short fellow. I guess John was about 5'6". And that was my experience with John. Uh, I think I had mentioned that the PASCHAL'S, which was across the street, they also had, in addition to their motel, uh, they had a nightclub called La Carousel. And many times when I'd close the store, I'd stop off and have a cocktail. And again, I was the only white person. It just didn't. I didn't think anything about it. It just wasn't something that registered with me really. I became very friendly with the treasurer of Morris Brown College. I think it was Morris Brown. Nice man, but he and I would have a cocktail, and I guess more than once. Friday nights, I usually closed a little bit late. I think I was open until 8:30 or 9. And I went across the street, and that's when they had a jazz group. He'd bring in famous jazz artists, and they would play Friday and Saturday. And I got to meet people like Dizzy Gillespie, and I met Wes Montgomery, Adderley, uh, and a number of others that were just nice guys. They came into the store. I'll never forget. Wes came in, and Wes Montgomery, and he wanted to buy the gaudiest jewelry that I had. I said, "What are you doing with stuff like this?" He says, "Because when I play," he said, "they'll see that, and it pivots their eyes to my hands." Anyway, that's how he bought the ugliest stuff in the world. He looked at me, he said, and but he bought about 4 or 5 pair of that ugly jewelry. Gee whiz, I'll never forget it. Nice guy. Wes was a nice guy. And he had a brother played with him too. I think his brother was a drummer.
We had two brothers. He had Buddy Montgomery.
Who played the drums?
Well, he had one brother was a vibes player, and another brother was an electric bass player.
Okay. Well, the guy who played the vibes evidently was also the percussionist.
Yeah.
And he was with him on that trip. When Dizzy came, he had a pianist by the name of Charlie Palmieri, white guy. Palmieri was a terrific piano player. Later on, he became famous playing bossa nova. Charlie Palmieri, I don't know whatever happened. He was a good musician. But these guys would come by. They had time to kill. The show didn't start till 8 or 9 o'clock, and I was open on Friday nights. They knew I'd come over, so I got to be friendly with them. I also got to be friendly with some ball players. And the guy I remember most was Dusty Baker. At that time, Dusty was playing with the Dodgers. And of course, he had a career that lasted, but still, as far as I know, he's managing Houston next week or next spring rather.
Let's hope.
This spring. He was a good guy. And there was another guy named John, believe it or not, John Glenn. And he and I were very friendly. And John also with the Dodgers. And whenever the Dodgers played, he'd always come by. And I remember one time he came by and he brought a bottle of Crown Royal with him as a gift for me. And I really was very impressed with that. It made a deep impression upon me. He was a nice guy. Another fellow who played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, he was a nice guy. You remember Broadway? There was a character that came by the store all the time.
Yeah, of course.
Broadway. His brother.
He lived in the store.
His brother, yeah. His brother was a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he would bring guys in I gotta tell you, getting old is something where your memory starts to fade. But certain things, like I told you,
Don Clendenin,
Don Clendenin. That's right.
that was Broadway's brother?
Yep,
Yeah,
that was Broadway's brother, Don Clendenin.
yeah, he played for the Pirates from 1961 to 1968.
That's
And then he
right.
spent a year in Montreal.
That's right.
Yeah.
And speaking of year in Montreal, I remember Jackie Robinson when he first broke in. Now he signed a contract right after the war, I believe. It was 46. And his first year was at Montreal, and he tore the league up. In 1947, I believe that was when he came in, Robinson came up, and I'll never forget this. The Dodgers were playing at night. They were night baseball. They were one of the ones who pioneered night baseball, and that was Branch Rickey. And they wore white satin uniforms. I'll never forget it. And I was so happy to see Robinson. And right from the beginning, he was something special. The thing about Robinson was he was out to beat him. The thing that made him such a wonderful ball player was his competitiveness. He wanted to play and he wanted to compete and he wanted to win. And that was Jackie's way. And when Ricky told him, he said, "There's certain things you have to allow, and certain things you're going to have to look the other way." All Jackie wanted to do was win, and I'll never forget it. Oh, he was quite a ball player.
And what do you think is, this will be the last question, what do you think Jackie's legacy is today?
Somebody asked me what Jackie's legacy is. It's on the baseball diamond. It's everywhere you see every team, and that, believe it or not, is Robinson and Ricky. Both of them equal in terms of credit for what they did. But his legacy is to see teams today. And if you remember the name Roberto Clemente,
Of course.
his legacy is simply to look at all the Latino ball